Let's break down 3 running backs and 3 wide receivers that are sneaky starts heading into the second round of the fantasy playoffs. These are players that may be sitting on your bench, they may be out there on waivers, and they may just have the upside you need if you're desperate going into week 16. And then let's break down the top streaming options at quarterback and tight end heading into week 16. All right, let's kick the video off with Rachaad White of the Tampa Bay Buccaneers. And I know Rachaad White, is a highly rostered player and is a player that ends up in the flex spot for a lot of you guys or is a desperation RB2. But I just want to remind you guys that Rachaad White is a very solid start going into week 16, and everybody just continues to write off Rachaad White like he's this useless fantasy football asset, but he's the RB21 on the season. He's averaged over 14 fantasy points per game, and I think the important thing to remember with Rachaad White and the situation here with the Buccaneers running backs is that Bucky Irving has still been limited throughout the entire week and has practiced in just a limited capacity as he's dealing with both a back and hip injury. And this is a team kind of headed towards the playoffs, right? They still need to win that division, but they're atop of that division, ahead of the Falcons, all that stuff. And they're going to want to keep Bucky Irving healthy and fresh going into the playoffs where they're going to need him the most. Now, I still think Bucky Irving is a great start this week. It's a great matchup for both running backs, but Rachaad White is still getting plenty of touches, work in the receiving game, and has scored a touchdown in every game since week 7 of the season, and in that stretch, every game since week 7 except for week 13 against the Panthers, and in that same stretch, he has double-digit fantasy points in all of those games except for week 13 against the Panthers, and he's coming off of a pretty dang good day against the Chargers where he had 14.1 fantasy points, 64 yards on the ground, 2 catches, 17 receiving yards, and a receiving touchdown in a game where Bucky Irving was completely dominant running the football with 15 touches for 117 rushing yards. So it's a great matchup here in week 16 as the Cowboys are giving up the 27th most fantasy points to the running back position. And then the following 2 weeks, week 17 in the fantasy championship for most people, he gets the Panthers giving up the most fantasy points to opposing running backs. Then in week 18, if you guys do play through week 18, the Bucs are playing the Saints. I mean, these are phenomenal matchups for both Bucky Irving and Rachaad White, but I really think the Bucs are going to continue to give Rachaad White essentially an equal workload here as they try to maintain the health of Bucky Irving. So if you own Rachaad White, he's a great flex option here in week 16, has a ton of sneaky upside, and is a player that I think is a very strong overall start heading into the second round of the fantasy playoffs. Next up, let's take a look at Kendre Miller of the New Orleans Saints, and it's starting the trend towards Kendre Miller being the starter at the running back position for the Saints in week 16. And I mean, really, since the beginning of the week, we've all known that this was a possibility as Alvin Kamara is dealing with that groin injury. But now this groin injury is looking more and more serious. And this was something I talked about in the early waiver video. Like, the Saints are playing for nothing. Okay, they just gave Kamara an extension this past season. And is Alvin Kamara going to want to risk his long-term health? Or are the Saints going to want to risk his long-term health? And they're playing for nothing. Like, it's such a real possibility that Alvin Kamara could get shut down for the season. And now all the reports are indicating that Kamara is actually potentially done for the season, right? Due to the groin injury. And yeah, if you're Alvin Kamara, why would you go out there? There's no starting quarterback. There's no real receivers. Taysom Hill is injured. I mean, it just makes the most sense that Alvin Kamara is going to end up not playing at least in week 16, but it makes plenty of sense that he's not going to play for the rest of the season. So it's a huge hit for Alvin Kamara owners. Don't get me wrong, but Kendre Miller is sitting at 35% rostered. Now, elephant in the room. They're going on the road here to Lambeau. The Green Bay Packers not that bad against the run, giving up the 14th fewest fantasy points to opposing running backs. And then once again, what is this Saints team? What is this offense? Jake Haener, Spencer Rattler, MVS is the wide receiver 1. Like, I mean, it's a bit of a mess here, but there's always garbage time. There's always some sort of value in wide receiver 1s and RB 1s on any given team. So if you're desperate, Kendre Miller, who was already a hot waiver wire ad going into the week, but like I said, sitting at 35% rostered, is more than likely going to be the RB1 for the Saints this weekend, and that provides some sort of upside. So if Kendre Miller is out there and available, he is a sneaky start going into week 16. All right, last running back I'm going to mention is Tyjae Spears of the Tennessee Titans, coming off a big game. He had 27.2 fantasy points against the Bengals in week 15. Didn't really do a whole lot on the ground, right? 4 touches, just 5 rushing yards, and that super cool touchdown that he scored, but he did a lot in the receiving game. 7 targets, 6 grabs, 87 receiving yards, and a receiving touchdown. So this is one of those situations that I do want to be kind of careful here about chasing points and everything. I mean, outside of this past week, Tyjae Spears has either been hurt or done nothing and been incredibly inefficient since weeks 3 and 4 of the season. I mean, he had double digits in both of those games, whether the receiving work got him there or he scored a touchdown, right? But nonetheless, this is a good matchup against the Colts, and the Titans are one of these teams in a weird situation. They're not playing for anything, right? I mean, they're going to start Mason Rudolph at quarterback. Like, what is this offense? I mean, what are we really looking at here? I guess maybe spoiling any last hope and dream that the Colts have of making the playoffs this season. But, I do want to be a little bit careful here, but he sits at 55% rostered, a little bit higher rostered even than Kendre Miller, and he could be an option this week as the Colts have given up the 24th most fantasy points to opposing running backs. And I do think we could see a similar situation almost to the Saints here with Alvin Kamara and Kendre Miller, because Tony Pollard's dealing with an ankle injury. He has not practiced throughout the week, and even if he is active in week 16, then he could see more of Tyjae Spears as they're trying to keep Tony Pollard healthy going into next season. And we could also see a scenario where maybe Pollard doesn't play this weekend, and that would completely elevate Tyjae Spears into startable territory going into week 16. But nonetheless, these Titans running backs have good matchups the rest of the way, at least for most of us, right? They get the Colts this week, then the Jaguars in week 17. Week 18, if you play through week 18, they get the Texans. That's not great, right? But ultimately, we want to pay attention to this Tony Pollard ankle injury. This could have a huge impact on Tyjae Spears. But even if Tony Pollard plays this weekend, Tyjae Spears coming off a great game, great matchup this week in week 16, could be a sneaky start as we approach the week. All right, let's move along to a few wide receivers, and let's start with Xavier Worthy of the Kansas City Chiefs, who's coming off a solid game. 11 targets, 6 catches, 46 receiving yards, 19.6 fantasy points, and a rushing touchdown. And this is a very solid matchup this week against the Houston Texans at home. Texans giving up the 27th most fantasy points to opposing wide receivers. They didn't look that bad this past week against the Dolphins, which was disappointing, as like the Dolphins wide receivers going into week 15. But, they're on the road here in Arrowhead. Patrick Mahomes looks like he's going to play. Ankle issue is not going to be too much of an issue. And I think the Chiefs really want to come out and win this game, and they're going to try and do whatever they can to secure that number 1 seed. Right now, don't forget, they only have 1 loss on the season. So these are 2 tough matchups in week 16 and 17, and week 18 as well is another tough matchup, right? I mean, they're going to face the Texans, the Steelers, and the Broncos, and the Steelers and the Broncos on the road. And they especially want to ensure that they get that number 1 seed now, because if they do, the way the schedule is set up, they'll have 21 days off in total, and that will completely help any issues that Patrick Mahomes may actually be having in terms of that ankle injury. So this is a big game for the Chiefs. I'm not surprised that Mahomes is now expected to play, but that is a good thing for Xavier Worthy, right? And, DeAndre Hopkins has been okay over the past couple weeks, and now we have Hollywood Brown potentially playing this weekend as well. Still got Kelsey, Noah Gray, all that stuff, but Xavier Worthy has really been one of the more consistent options alongside Hopkins in terms of receiving threats and fantasy for the Chiefs as of late, coming off a very solid game. Great matchup. And I just think he's one of these players who, on a weekly basis, you're just kind of like, do I really want to risk Xavier Worthy? What's the upside? Am I going to get the floor? Am I going to get the high ceiling? What is it going to be? Is he actually going to score a touchdown? Well, he matches up pretty well against the Texans defense and the secondary, just like he matched up very well against the Cleveland Browns secondary. So if you own him, I do think the floor is safe going into week 16, encouraging that Mahomes is likely to start on Saturday for Xavier Worthy and the rest of the Chiefs pass catchers. And ultimately, it's a good matchup. I think Xavier Worthy is a solid flex with some sneaky upside in week 16. All right, another young wide receiver coming off of a big game is Jalen McMillan of the Tampa Bay Buccaneers, who had 18.5 fantasy points in week 15, 6 targets, 5 grabs, 75 receiving yards, and a touchdown. In the previous week, 21.9 fantasy points, 2 very solid games in a row. And we've seen plenty of contribution from Mike Evans, Bucky Irving, Rachaad White, and some sprinkles of Cade Otton, Sterling Shepard. So there's a lot of mouths to feed in this offense. They're really starting to get into their groove since we saw the hamstring injury to Mike Evans and Chris Godwin out for the year. Bucky a little bit banged up. I mean, they absolutely popped off in the second half against the Chargers, played a solid game against the Raiders, and it's really nice to see another wide receiver finally starting to step up since Chris Godwin went down early in the season. Now, we want to be careful here. We got 2 good games in a row. Don't want to go chasing points too much, but it is a very solid matchup against the Dallas Cowboys, giving up the 24th most fantasy points to opposing wide receivers on the season. And one thing I didn't mention when we talked about Rachaad White, one of the reasons why I like the Buccaneers players so much this weekend is because they're trying to do whatever they can to absolutely win the rest of the way through the season to ensure that they win the NFC South and that they make it into the playoffs. So they're going to have their foot all the way on the gas. They're not going to let up against the Cowboys, and any of these Bucs players are viable for a big game going into week 16 on Sunday Night Football. So McMillan has moved up to 42% rostered, one of the most added players in this past week's waiver period. But if he's still out there and available, you're in need of a flex spot, a wide receiver in general. I think Jalen McMillan, due to the matchup, due to the game script, and the way that the Buccaneers offense is playing right now, has a lot of upside going in to week 16. I think Jalen McMillan's current line on Underdog for receiving yards, currently sitting at 34.5 receiving yards, is an absolute steal. He has smashed that in the past 2 weeks. It's a great matchup this week. Primetime football on Sunday night. I'm heading straight to Underdog to take the over on McMillan's total receiving yards. If you guys don't know, all new users who sign up on Underdog using promo code TheCatch are going to get a free NFL Pick'em to use towards Week 16's action. Take that free Pick'em. Take the over on McMillan's total receiving yards. Once both of those lines hit, you'll automatically triple your cash entry. And on top of that, as long as you guys sign up using promo code TheCatch, that link is down below, Underdog is also going to give you a 50% deposit match up to $1,000. And last but not least, let's take a look at DeMario Douglas of the New England Patriots. And I don't know if Douglas particularly has a lot of upside, but I think if you're desperate, you don't have anything better, you need a flex option. He sits at 35% rostered. He's one of these players that on any given week will get you about 9, 10, 11 fantasy points. I mean, he's had 9 or more fantasy points in every game since week 9, except for week 13, and double digits in 3 of those games. And coming off of a game where he scored a touchdown, only a second touchdown on the season, 10.1 fantasy points against the Cardinals, 3 targets, 3 catches, 11 receiving yards, and that receiving touchdown. Now, on paper, it's a bit of a tough matchup against the Bills, but they have moved back to giving up the 16th most fantasy points to wide receivers. Literally, just a few weeks ago, this was the defensive unit giving up the fewest fantasy points to opposing wide receivers, and they have just really fallen off the wagon, especially in the last 2 weeks. So I don't know how worried I am about this Bills secondary at the moment. I do think this Bills team is light years better than the Patriots. I think they could come out and have a huge day on all sides of the football against the Patriots, but that could benefit DeMario Douglas in a way, because then the Patriots are going to be in this position where they're needing to throw the football and playing catch up. And I think that is, in essence, a good thing for DeMario Douglas in any Patriots pass catcher, but there's no other Patriots pass catcher outside of maybe Hunter Henry that you can trust in any fashion on this team right now when it comes to fantasy football. So DeMario Douglas has been really the only consistent startable wide receiver for the Patriots in fantasy football this season. This matchup is a little bit better than you may think, and the game script should be there to where DeMario Douglas is benefited. So I don't know if he has a ton of upside per se, but he could be sneaky if you're just looking for a floor out of desperation going in to Week 16. Very quickly here, let's run through our streaming options at quarterback and tight end. And let's start with Matthew Stafford himself going up against the New York Jets, who are giving up the 21st most fantasy points to opposing quarterbacks. The Rams going to have their foot all the way on the gas, as right now they're sitting atop of their division. They're going to do whatever they can to continue to win each and every game for the rest of the season. They're on the road here against the Jets, who have some new life pumped into them, but ultimately, like I said, it's a good matchup for Stafford. I know he was awful in Week 15, but you take away the Week 15 game, every game since Week 11, 2 or more passing touchdowns and 15 or more fantasy points in all those games, 19 or more in 3 of those 4 games. So I think Stafford is still a streaming option. He sits at 56% rostered. It could be a lot worse, and he may have gotten dropped in your respective league due to the performance last week on Thursday Night Football. Then we got Aaron Rodgers in that same matchup. I mean, 30 fantasy points this past week. I know it was against the Jags, 16 of 30, 289 passing yards, 3 passing touchdowns. 45 yards on the ground. Where was that all season, A-Rod? And it's a good matchup here against the Rams at home, giving up the 23rd most fantasy points to opposing quarterbacks. So, I mean, we look over the past couple of weeks, 15 or more fantasy points in each of his last 4 games, 17 or more in 2 of those, 2 or more passing touchdowns in 3 of those games. I mean, I don't know if the ceiling's going to reach what he did this past week, but ultimately the floor is there. I don't want to go chasing last week's points. I don't think Rodgers is going to do what he did this past week against the Rams, but it is a good matchup overall. The Jets are at home. I think it's going to be a competitive game overall. Even though the Jets are playing for nothing, I think they're still going to come out here at home and try and win, and maybe win for Aaron Rodgers and Devontae Adams' pride. But ultimately, I like the game script. Good matchups for both quarterbacks. Then we got Cooper Rush, who over the past couple of weeks, we've talked a lot about him being a streaming candidate. And last week, we talked about him specifically, 19 fantasy points, 3 passing touchdowns, 18 of 29, 214 passing yards. And this week, he gets another smash matchup against the Tampa Bay Buccaneers, giving up the 31st most fantasy points to opposing quarterbacks. And we look at it, since he's become the starter, 17 or more fantasy points in every game except for 2. And in Week 14 against the Bengals, although it wasn't a great fantasy day, I talked about this in last week's video, it was still a pretty good day passing the football. If you take away the interception, he just didn't really throw the football a lot the way that game script went. Then in Week 13, it wasn't a good fantasy day, but he didn't need to throw the football. I mean, the Cowboys were just dominating the Giants, right? So he really has been actually pretty solid overall in terms of real life football, in terms of what he's been doing and being a backup quarterback and coming in, filling in for Dak Prescott in a season where the season is lost for the Cowboys, but ultimately has been pretty okay in most of these starts for fantasy, and it is a great matchup. Good game script on Sunday Night Football for Cooper Rush. You could do a lot worse than Cooper Rush going into Week 16, in my opinion. And last but not least, we've got Aiden O'Connell. If he does get to start this week and the knee injury does not hold him back, I think he's a solid start, as the Jags are giving up the most fantasy points to opposing quarterbacks. So it's all going to depend. He has practiced this week. It looks like he's trending towards playing. I mean, there's still plenty of weapons on this offense. Brock Bowers, Jacoby Myers, whatever Frankenstein room of running backs that they have out there this week. There are playmakers here. It's the Jaguars. Aiden O'Connell sits at 7% rostered. You could definitely do a lot worse than Aiden O'Connell this week as well. Then let's take a look at a couple tight ends. Zach Ertz, if he does play this week, he was upgraded on Thursday's practice to limited, dealing with that concussion. I think he's still very startable, okay? And he might get dropped in your league because he is questionable, dealing with the concussion. He had 18.7 fantasy points the last time he played Philly. That was on the road. 3 touchdowns in 3 straight games, if we're not including this past week where he suffered the concussion. Tight end 12 on the season. He is 62% rostered, but if he does get dropped, he's a player that you can scoop up and start at the tight end position, and he should come through with a safe floor, even in a tougher matchup. Then we got Brenton Strange. The Strange man is back. He did pop up on the injury report, which I don't love. It's a shoulder injury, but it looks like he should still play this week. And if he does, great matchup against the Raiders, giving up the 29th most fantasy points, 2 opposing tight ends. Big day in week 15, filling in for Evan Ingram, who's now on IR. 18.3 fantasy points, 12 targets, 11 catches, 73 receiving yards. Looks like Mac Jones going to go out there and sling it again. And I didn't put Mac Jones on the list today, by the way, but Mac Jones could be an okay streaming option. I just don't trust him as much as the quarterbacks you see on the screen. But if Brenton Strange plays this week, he's pretty far up there in terms of streaming options at tight end for me here in week 16. Then we got Dalton Kincaid, who does sit at 80% rostered, but I feel like Dalton Kincaid's available in a lot of the leagues I'm in, has been dropped, picked up, moved around, all that stuff. People don't trust him, but he had a pretty solid day in week 15, 7 targets, 4 grabs, 53 receiving yards, and 9.3 fantasy points. So if he's out there available, I like the matchup this week against the Patriots. I think the Bills could come out and do a lot of damage to this Patriots defense. So could be a lot worse. He is pretty highly rostered, but I haven't been very high on Kincaid as of late and have encouraged you guys to move on for a few weeks now. But if he's out there and available, I would take him this week over a lot of tight ends. And then last but not least, we got Pat Freiermuth, who has moved up to 61% rostered. But this is probably as solid of a tight end stream as you're going to find. He's moved up to the tight end 8 on the season, 3 touchdowns in 3 straight games, double digits in his last 3 games as well. Good matchup against the Ravens, who have improved against the tight end position, but are still giving up the 21st most fantasy points to opposing tight ends. George Pickens is out this week. There's no real threat at wide receiver. You got Calvin Austin, Van Jefferson, and Mike Williams, Ben Skowronek. I mean, it's a mess at wide receiver. And Freiermuth, we talked about this past week. So a tough matchup against the Eagles, but his volume's going to be increased. His red zone opportunity is going to be increased. There's not anyone to throw to here. So should be the same story this week. Should come through, have another solid outing in week 16. And that'll do it for today's video. There are 6 sneaky starts heading into week 16 of the 2024 fantasy football season, and your streaming options at quarterback and tight end. As always, guys, I'm answering as many fantasy football questions as I can in the comment section down below. So if you guys need anything whatsoever, moving into the second round of the fantasy playoffs, please drop me a comment. I'll get back to as many of you guys as I possibly can. But most importantly, make sure that you guys are subscribed to the channel so that you don't miss out on any of the content, because we're going to have everything you guys could possibly need to help you dominate the rest of the 2024 fantasy football season. So make sure you guys subscribe on the way out so that you don't miss out on any of the videos. And with that, I'll say thank you guys so much for watching and or listening. And remember, you saw it here on The Catch.